And we are live on Energy Superheroes. Today we have Andrew Griffiths, and Andrew is the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Planetmark. Planetmark is a verification tool that confirms companies are reducing their CO2 footprint. He's also the chair of the National Sustainability Task Force at the Institute of Directors. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
It's great to be here, Peter.
So this is a question a lot of investors care about. Why should businesses be taking sustainability seriously? And why does that matter so much to investors?
Yeah, of course. There are three buckets of rationale behind why sustainability makes good business sense in many ways. There's moral, financial, and legal. So on the moral front, people are very familiar with the arguments and things, and I can throw a bunch of stats out. But honestly, I tend to find the most thing that resonates with people the most is when you ask a question like when you were growing up, Peter, and you were a kid and you went out for a drive in the countryside, were there more bugs hitting the windscreen or less when you were a kid?
That's a great question. I think there were more. I think there
Right?
were more bugs.
Yeah, like you used to have to get out and wash the windscreen off every 10 minutes because there were so many. And that I could tell you stats around how much we've lost in terms of insect life and wildlife, but I don't need to because you've seen it. You know yourself. And the same thing with roadkill. The same thing with for a lot of places where they used to get a lot more snow, certainly here in the UK and London. I remember growing up every year it would snow, and every year they'd be out there digging some snow in the things. It just doesn't happen now. And I was on a skiing holiday in France a couple of weeks back, and the highest point in France, Mont Blanc, and the valley, the Chamonix Valley there. So there was a chart up at the top of one of the tourist destinations, and it said that in since 1980, Chamonix Valley, one of the highest points in Europe, has lost 50% of its snowfall.
Wow, that's a crazy statistic. I'll give
And
you
each,
another one. So
yeah,
right here I'm in South Florida. I grew up here, and the beaches are a lot smaller. And
yeah,
the great thing is if you're ever down here, a lot of folks go to the Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach.
yeah,
Go to the Breakers, turn to the right and look. There's a picture of the beach, how it was when the Breakers first got going back when Henry Flagler started it. And the
yeah,
beach is massive. When you go back to the Breakers now and look out, the ocean comes pretty much to the seawall. There's just
yeah,
beach, like a postage stamp beach back there now. So for us
yeah,
here in South Florida, we see it on a year to year basis, really.
100%. And so there's all these things which are your own sort of personal experiences and signs of what is happening. Like it is insane that I can say to anyone in any country were more bugs hitting your windscreen when you drove in the countryside. And the universal answer is, you know what? Yeah, there used to be way more. And in the UK alone, I think we've lost about 70% of our insect life. That's bonkers. That's the start of a food chain, pretty much. Like just being wiped out. And that knock on effects on birds, on other species is wild. The moral arguments make themselves when you start realizing quite how many tangible things you're already experiencing. And also when you put into context that what we're talking about here in terms of the risks of warming, 1.5 to 2 degrees warmer doesn't sound like much when we're looking at the moment about 3, 4 degrees of warming based on our current trajectory. To put that in context, 3, 4 degrees cooler than before industrial levels, that's the last ice age. So like, the other end of the spectrum is ice age. We don't know what's at this end of this. We do, but it's some scary impacts that we are all witnessing wherever we are. So morals, you've got to mention it. It's there for sure. But often what's going to be of a lot of interest to businesses and to investors is the financial arguments. What are the business benefits, right? And that can be everything from the brand and marketing benefits, where you can talk about it, you can gain new customers, increase customer loyalty, those sorts of things. But also there's huge opportunities to cut costs. We look at what's going on with energy. The cheapest unit of energy is the one that you don't use.
A really great point. And energy efficiency is huge and it's cost saving. And for a lot of businesses, energy is one of the biggest, if not the biggest input. So to be
Absolutely.
able to save that energy is going to reduce costs. And we should be reducing costs across the board. I'm a big believer on the moral side too, but
Mm.
regardless, you can get to the numbers and see that there's value in reducing costs.
Oh, 100%. Also, installing on-site renewables if you have a facility or a site where you can fit them on the roof or in the grounds, because solar panels are now at a point where they have a payback period of about 2 to 3 years max. And we've got members who 25, 30% of their energy is created by themselves on site. And they've now since they paid that off in about 2 years, and they're now making about 135 grand a year on savings through the fact that they are producing all their own energy that they need for their manufacturing.
I'm a huge believer in on-site, and I think that on-site energy should apply to just about every company at this point, and it's a
Yep.
big low-hanging. We have to admit that the power grid is very valuable. It's very difficult to do, let's say, utility scale solar with battery backup, but if you can do on-site energy, you benefit from the dramatic fall in the cost of wind and solar, and you put that
Yeah.
on your site, and then doing smaller scale battery backups and or relying on the grid, we can do it today.
Yeah, 100%. And if you have access and you don't have on-site storage, sell it back to the grid.
Absolutely.
So I think that there's opportunities to make money. And if you can cut your costs, these are things that go directly to the bottom line. There's no cost of saving. There are costs of sale. There's no cost of saving. So if you can save money, then there's really simple ways of doing it. So a couple of practical examples. I always like to say, you can't manage what you don't measure. And one of my favorite examples of this is a story our COO tells, where he used to be head of sustainability for a big hotel chain that operates here in the UK. And they installed the measurement on sites where they were able to look at different spaces within the hotels and the energy consumption happening with at 15-minute intervals. And they found that there was one particular hotel, one particular restaurant in that hotel that was using way more energy than the others. And in particular, it was using a huge amount of energy between about 6 in the morning and 8 in the morning before they were actually serving food. Okay, what's this going on about? So they went and chatted to the chef and said, notice that you're using huge amounts of energy between these hours. Like, what's going on? And it turned out that because they have to turn the equipment on and heat it up, rather than the chef coming in 15 minutes early to turn everything on, he had a deal with the security guard to turn everything on when he was doing his rounds, like 2 hours early. And so everything's burning hot for 2 hours for no reason. And they worked out that, and the deal the chef had with the security guard is, I'll give you a free hot dog every morning as a thank you. Now, they worked out that this hot dog was costing the company £25,000 a year. It's, and like, this is pre-COVID. So like, now it's like 150 grand. Like, it's,
Yeah,
um,
so I have an economics degree, and I'm pretty much a geek when it comes to that stuff. We call those perverse incentives.
yeah, yeah. And where they were like, we're measuring now, so we understand we're going to we're going to align our incentives and targets and start doing league tables between the different restaurants to try and improve our efficiency of how we're using our kitchens. Had a huge impact. So I think, as another example, a sort of employee-led kind of thing, previous company that I worked at was in electronics, and when I arrived at the company, we weren't recycling like anything. And I was like, I want to get this sorted. So I spoke to the head of facilities and I said, I think we should be recycling. So give me the last 12 months of waste invoices and I will find a way to cut our costs. I'll find a way to save us money. And went out to the market to have a look around. We ended up staying with the same waste management provider. But as soon as we asked them, so if we recycle, could we save money? They went, yeah, of course, we sell the recycling. We can't cost us money to do the landfill waste. So yeah, of course. We're like, okay, interesting. We basically, for a total investment of about 250 quid to buy some new bins, we went from 100% to landfill to being 87% directly recycled, remainder to waste to energy, and we saved £1,000 a month on waste. And they were, why don't we do this sooner? It's 12 grand a year straight to the bottom line.
That's a huge deal for a small business, and those kind of and that's where we're gonna have to change things. It's really a micro problem, not a macro problem, in my view.
Absolutely. But then on the financial front, there's mitigating risk as well. Like stranded assets are going to become a huge problem with changes to our natural environment, where there will be dams that won't be able to produce enough hydropower to be viable because the rivers will be changing and altering in terms of their flows, seasonality, and all sorts of things like that. And other things that become stranded assets where the initial prediction of how much value investors would get back from them doesn't work because the time frame that they operate for doesn't go as long as it was expected to. So stranded assets is a big problem. Then the final bucket, so that's the financial bucket. You've got your opportunities for making money, you've got your opportunities for saving money, and then you're mitigating your risk for future losses. And then, but the third bucket is legal. And this one is of increasing importance in that around the world, in the US, Europe, UK, wherever you go, legislation is now starting to come into effect that mandates reporting, mandates coming up with net zero transition plans. And at the moment, that's mainly affecting larger companies. However, there's this kind of unique cascade of legislation that's never really happened with anything else before that happens with sustainability, particularly to do with carbon emissions, whereby the fact that supply chain emissions are such a massive component of an organization's footprint through scope 3 emissions, that means that the large companies have to ask their small suppliers for carbon footprint information. So even though the law doesn't pertain to a small business necessarily, they'll find that one of their massive customers, often like a halo brand, reaches out to them and says, I need your carbon footprint because I have to report. And that's not really happened before. We've got other kinds of international legislation on things like modern slavery, right? And how we tackle modern slavery. And large businesses have to report data back on what they're doing to tackle modern slavery. But they never go to a really small supplier and say, give me your data on modern slavery. You might have a policy in place or something. But you have to report information up to them. Whereas with carbon, you absolutely have to and will. And certainly within Europe, in the next 12 to 18 months, anyone who is anywhere in the supply chain of a large company is going to be asked for data. And a lot of businesses aren't seeing that coming because the legislation doesn't specifically mention them. But there's this like indirect knock-on effect that's blindsiding a lot of people, where we've seen massive companies like Coca-Cola and Tesco and others reaching out and saying, we need your carbon footprint now, sometimes with only 3 months notice. And you need to set your net zero target, you need to develop an action plan, and you need to switch to renewable energy, which is great, but often it's on a quite tight turnaround. We've seen people falling off of supplier lists because they have failed to meet the deadlines that have been set by the large corporates.
Wow. Yeah, I have not heard that before. And I know it's true because I understand how scope one, two, and three emissions work. So certainly it's going to matter. And it's not surprising to me the large companies are not giving their small suppliers a lot of time, because that's typical of just a big company. You're the 800-pound gorilla, so you can ask for what you want.
Yeah.
And yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So I imagine the price of high quality carbon credits is probably going to go through the roof over the next number of years as companies really try to move towards more of a net zero. But
It
putting
depends
them,
because so carbon credits, as in related to kind of buying carbon offsets, is a component of net zero, but it's not the most important one. If people are trying to go, if everyone's going carbon neutral, then that's heavy offset. That's, you measure your carbon footprint and you offset 100% of your emissions. And now I'm carbon neutral. So that, I know, carbon negative, carbon positive, climate positive, that tends to mean instead of buying 100% of your emissions, you're buying 200, 300, or 400%. But often for carbon neutrality, companies are measuring a smaller set. Legally, they can just be measuring scope 1 and 2 emissions and ignore scope 3 to claim they're carbon neutral, which is a bit of a problem, because to put into context for people listening in, if I came to you today, said, I am the most sustainable of sustainables, I am a sustainability hero, and then you found out the only thing I had measured was my utility bills and my car, if I owned one, and I'd left out the food that I eat, the places I travel, the products that I buy. I've left out all of that very materially relevant stuff. You might not think I'd necessarily done enough to justify my holier than thou approach.
of course, and this is what I think gets a lot of the, let's say, wealthy individuals in trouble,
Yeah.
who are at the forefront of pushing the, let's call it, climate change movement. And I get it. Like, you're a wealthy individual, you want to fly your private jet, you want to have a big, nice house, and so on. And you want to buy carbon offsets to offset that footprint. But I think increasingly, if the standard becomes you have to do a certain amount yourself, you can't just buy carbon offsets. We're not going to count that. I think it's going to be a challenge both for small businesses, as you say, and also for, say, wealthy individuals who currently have enormous carbon footprints as individuals and tend to just buy carbon offsets to mitigate that.
Exactly. And that's why the whole push in terms of legislation and in terms of international progress and movements is not about carbon neutrality. Carbon neutral is it's a nice, but it has to be a step on the journey toward net zero. It's not an end point in and of itself. Because with net zero, the net zero standard by the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is the internationally recognized standard for what net zero means, that means that you have, for most businesses, you need to reduce your carbon footprint from your base by 90%. And you're only allowed to use offsets for up to that last 10%. So let's say I'm a bicycle manufacturer. We can all agree bicycles are a great thing and we want to make them. They're a good thing. So let's imagine I'm a small bicycle manufacturer and I have 1,000-ton carbon footprint, right? There's going to be some unavoidable residual emissions just in the fact that I'm making something physical out of metal and alloys and whatever. So, right, there's some of unavoidable emissions there. So in order to be net zero, I would have to reduce my carbon footprint by 900 tons, and I can buy carbon removal offsets for up to that last 100 tons. Right? Whereas if I wanted to be carbon neutral, I could just buy 1,000 tons of carbon offsets today. I'm carbon neutral. So it's a very different challenge. It's a very different sort of level of achievement to go for net zero versus carbon neutrality. So the message that certainly we're sending to all of our 700 plus members is you need to be focused on reductions first and foremost, achieve reductions and achieve efficiencies, and then think about offsets once you're doing everything you can in the short to medium term to reduce those emissions up front.
Wow. So 90-10, that's a big number. Absolutely. I've got so many questions for you around this. It's hard to know where to start. Out of the gate, I'd say maybe you're not ideal to answer this question, but how do you deal with the political challenges of higher energy costs? Because we just see that as companies are going to reduce their carbon footprint and come to more, let's say, carbon neutral sources of energy, the costs in the short run are inevitably going to go up. And I don't think that message has been communicated enough throughout the sort of value chain. And I hear you on businesses being able to reduce and save money. But if let's say we move away from fossil fuels and we move to renewable natural gas. In the US, for example, gas is like $2.50 an MMBTU. And then if you go to renewable natural gas, it's $20 an MMBTU. So it's a lot more expensive. And we're seeing that in different categories. I'm a big proponent of hydrogen. We think hydrogen will eventually get to where it's as cost effective as fossil fuels, but it certainly isn't there yet.
Yeah.
And how do we cross that bridge?
So there's a few sort of things within this question. So the first thing for us to establish is, so why are energy prices going up and why are they going to go up? And the first thing to establish unequivocally is that when you account for all of the subsidies that both fossil fuels, renewable energies, or technologies get, and you account for all of that, renewable energy is already cheaper. It's already cheaper. And one of the things that the UK government are considering over here at the moment is splitting out renewable energy from fossil fuel energy to make it clear that if you are on a renewable tariff, you're generating, receiving renewable energy, that is bringing savings to your energy bill, not costs. Fossil fuels are more expensive. They're just easier to use and they're a larger scale already, right? So that's the first thing, is that renewable energy is cheap. So if we invest well into renewables and the development of renewables, considering the fact that they're still getting better, they're still getting more efficient, they're still getting stronger, that's going to benefit us over the longer term and will end up being a heck of a lot cheaper than if we invest tons more into our fossil fuel infrastructure. The second component of it is around, okay, what's the ideal mix? How do we manage this with intermittent power from solar and wind and things like that? How do we manage this? And that's absolutely where we're going to have a mixture of intermittent and consistent approaches, right? And so the ideal is to have as much solar and wind as we possibly can do. And then we manage the intermittent nature of those things through a few different methods. One is to have some kind of storage, right? That can either be through batteries, or it can be through converting energy into hydrogen. That's more easy to store, ship, reprocess. Or it might be giant sand batteries are being tested in Scandinavia, where they heat up huge vats of sand, and sand is very good at maintaining thermal capacity. And so it can be used to let off that heat over a very long period of time throughout a whole winter, for example. So storage is one sort of method. The second is on having alternative energies that feed into it that are lower carbon, lower pollution, things like that. So that's where you get into sort of natural gas, also nuclear. There was a big announcement in the UK budget last week, which was about where they said we are categorizing nuclear as a green source of energy. And we're going to invest more into nuclear as part of that.
I think that's a huge game changer. This is something I got in the energy sector back in the 2000s, right? And from the very early days, we were saying you got to do nuclear because it's zero carbon. And a lot of people still don't. If you ask the average man on the street, does nuclear emit carbon? They'll say it does
Yeah.
because it's been demonized, I think, for a long time. But now
Yes.
we're coming around to the dispatchable power is essential to a net zero
Absolutely. And
at
so I think
scale. Yeah.
things that can be rapidly turned on and off. It's very hard to rapidly turn on and off a solar panel or a wind farm, but we're seeing a lot of old coal energy plants in the UK being converted into natural gas energy plants. Why? Because coal, you've got to keep it burning hot the whole time. You can't turn it off. Whereas natural gas, you can fire it up quickly and you can massively scale capacity and ramp it back down again in a relatively short period of time. You're not creating a giant bonfire.
I
Keep
tell
burning
people
slow.
it's like a giant aircraft engine. You can ramp it up and down, and it's
Exactly.
much
And
cleaner
it's the
than
same with
coal.
nuclear. You can ramp it up, you can ramp it down and manage that capacity on the grid. So I think that's the kind of mix that we're working toward, is to move away from the high intensity and sort of high carbon fuels and move towards having a mix of pure renewables and then low carbon, rapid sort of response energies that can be used to manage grid capacity.
Gotcha. Hey, let's get more into the depths of Planet Mark because I think it's a really exciting company and you've got a lot of customers. Tell us the niche in the market that you guys are filling. And I don't know if you're looking for investors at this point, if you already have investors in the round, but if you can talk to that at all, would love to know more about the company.
Yeah, of course. We're 10 years old in a few days' time. We take
Congratulate.
something. Thank you. And so we launched in 2013. And really, with the premise of initially, it was about supporting small and medium sized businesses with sustainability and helping them in a way that was affordable. And then we kind of scale upwards from there. So we have over 700 members. We support every sector. And so we've got everyone from toy shops on Sheffield High Street through to Volvo, huge sort of multinational law firms and all sorts. We operate globally. So we have members in the US, Europe, UK, across Asia, Australasia, Oceania, whatever. So we operate everywhere. And there are three key things that are unique to what our USP is. The first is that it's a verification, not a carbon calculator, right? So there are lots of carbon calculators on these there where you can plug in some numbers, it spits some numbers out, and nobody's checked whether or not it's all true. Whereas with us, you have to submit your data, but you also have to submit evidence. So submit your energy consumption, but then we also want the bills we check, right? So it's a verification of the carbon footprint. The second difference is that it's a mark of progress. You have to be reducing your carbon footprint year on year in order to be recertified. That's always what it's been the whole 10 years. We have a 99% success rate for our members succeeding to reduce each year. And on average, last year, I think our members reduced their absolute carbon footprint by 12% on average and by 14% per employee. We measured over 300,000 tons of carbon emission reductions last year alone. Then the third differentiator is that because we expect these reductions to happen, we have to help. We can't just measure carbon footprint, see you in a year's time, good luck. We actually have to be far more hands-on. So we have a sort of 3-pillar process: measure, engage, communicate. Can't manage what you don't measure, so you've got to start with that. But then the engagement piece is about how do you engage your employees, investors, your suppliers, your customers about what you're doing and get them on board on the journey and get them excited about how they can play a role in helping your company to decarbonize. And then the communicate step, we have dedicated communications teams separate from our marketing team who just exist to help our members talk authentically and credibly about what they're doing, because it's important they shout about it, because that's how you magnify your impact 100-fold. Because if you can get other businesses faster along their own journeys because they can learn from you, amazing impact. But equally, you don't want to get accused of greenwashing. So you've got to do it in a way that's credible, defensible, evidence-based. And so that's what we support. So yeah, everything. So we do organizational carbon footprints. We also do real estate, built environment, construction, where on average, our building projects have a 25% reduced carbon footprint, whole life, including embodied emissions and operation. And yeah, it's basically help people cut carbon and shout about it.
No, that's amazing. And the fact that you guys have been around for 10 years, assume the company's profitable at this point?
Oh yeah, yeah, it always has been. We bootstrapped throughout. So we've never actually gone out for anything other than family and friends investment. And it's sort of a handy thing about the business model to a certain extent in that it's an annual certification. So it's a SaaS product in a sense. And most companies are renewing on either a calendar year or financial year. And that means that each year with the renewals, we have a 95% renewal rate. So with renewals, we get a bit of a war chest that we can then invest against for the remainder of the year. And that's helped us to expand in an organic fashion. Up until this point, we may be going out for investment soon. Watch this space. But yeah, we wanted to have very specific needs before we started going down that route because we didn't need to.
And no, that is awesome. And I'll tell you, there aren't too many companies that make it 10 years old in this sector without taking institutional capital. So my hat's off to you. And you're
Yeah.
probably going to get knocks on the door after we post this from multiple parties that are interested in the business. Just putting my M&A hat on, finding a 10-year-old business in this segment with recurring revenue that is family owned or say closely held is rare, impressive. So hats off to you guys.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we get approached quite a bit. Yeah, and we're sort of moving into a phase now where the market is shifting, where we've started as a high engagement, low tech kind of company. And we recognize that the technology is playing a bigger and bigger role. So we've been investing heavily into tech in the last few years. And that's the sort of thing where, if we do go out for investment, it will be to hyper speed tech development and marketing going for pushing out globally. Because at the moment we're expanding globally by accident, I would say, through people hearing about us, but then also through supply chains and multinational companies. But we've yet to make a concerted effort to go, right, let's move into this market and gun for it. And so that'll be one of the things we start looking at in the next couple of years.
I know for sure the right partner can help you expand globally in a way that is difficult for a closely held business to do
Yeah.
on their own.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. We're big believers in collaboration. We work with a lot of partners around the world. So we are one of around 10 organizations worldwide who are an official partner of the UN's Race to Zero campaign. Basically means when an organization pledges a net zero target with us, it's automatically recognized by the UN because they've scrutinized our processes and said, yeah, we're happy that the Planet Mark's methodology is good, sound, and meets the criteria of the Race to Zero. And similarly, we've recently been recognized as an early adopter of the ISO net zero guidelines, which is the first sort of end-to-end set of best practices for what a good net zero target looks like, plan, how you claim that you've achieved net zero, and also the wider governance principles around what good leadership practices are around net zero, which includes things like aligning your executive and board pay and incentives to achieving net zero targets. It includes disclosing shareholder voting on climate related issues. And it includes incorporating your net zero targets into key governance documentation of the organization, whether that be the articles of association or charters, laws, whatever it might be.
Wow, that's amazing. So I didn't know that about it. Is it ISO 900?
So this ISO net zero guidelines. So it was developed last year in the build up to COP27 through an international workshop agreement process. So it's not a standard yet. It's a set of guidelines for what best practice is. And it was a huge collaboration where they had thousands of people input into it over a 3-month period where there were like 36 hours of workshops and three written response rounds to develop this one set of guidelines. And it was insane. Every workshop would be 3 hours long and we'd have 120 people scrutinizing the document and debating line by line, word by word, what the best practices should be. It was a fascinating process and it's a really helpful document for businesses to check out because it really does set out what is best practice, what should you include in your net zero target, your net zero plan, and how do you make credible progress?
No, unbelievable. How do people find out more about? Is it on the UN's website or that's an interesting? I have not heard about that.
Yeah. So if you go to so for the ISO net zero guidelines, iso.org forward slash net zero is where you can find that. Check out the net zero guidelines on there. And then with the race to zero, if you Google the race to zero, you'll see it on the UN FCCC website. And I think there's more than 15,000 organizations who have set net zero targets now with this. And it's not just organizations, it's cities, it's universities, it's a full spectrum. And it's been a big driver of a lot of the governments to try and drive net zero target setting by industry through this initiative. It's the biggest initiative of its kind worldwide.
For sure, it's critical because if you don't have standards, how do you know how you're going to meet them? And I think that's what Planet Mark is all about. So that aligns with your mission, obviously.
100%. But I'll share links across that you can include
Got
in the
the link,
comments
yeah.
or in the notes where those, yeah.
No, that's perfect. We'll link to it in the show notes as well as we'll link to Planet Mark. So, Andrew, tell me about your role at Planet Mark and who should be reaching out to you.
They head up policy and partnerships, basically. On the policy front, it's around how we as Planet Mark engage with policymakers. That's both in terms of scoping what legislation is going to affect us and our business and our products, and also what's going to affect our members. What legislation is coming down the pipe that our members need to be aware of that we can help them understand the impacts of it and how they can apply and indeed demonstrate best practice and go above and beyond. And then also, how do we back, right? How do we have over 700 members counting. And so our ability to act as a combined voice to legislators to say, we're working very hard to be leading the way on net zero standards, net zero best practices. So being able to turn to policymakers and say, guys, this is what good looks like. Here's what we need as a sector. And here's what SMEs need. So we just published a paper in partnership with Amazon looking at the barriers, challenges, opportunities, and policy and funding needs of small and medium-sized businesses when it comes to net zero. That certainly I've had very good feedback from the UK government on, oh, this is really interesting. It gives us a lot of ideas to move things forward in terms of legislating for the SME sort of marketplace. Yeah, so that's the policy front. So if people are engaging in either international or national sort of climate policy and interesting things like that, by all means reach out. And then on the partnerships front, we work with a lot of trade associations and trade bodies and sort of organizations who have networks that they want to serve in the sustainability space. For example, we work with the Institute of Directors and supporting their membership and supporting them on their own sustainability journey. But then also people like that, we are partnered with the Royal Warrant Holders Association. What that means is we essentially certify the royal supply chain for its sustainability. So we support people who are supplying the royal family. And it's a very surreal community because it's everything from one second you're talking to Samsung or someone who's supplying screens into sort of Buckingham Palace and stuff. And then the next second you're talking to a chimney sweep.
No, I can't let this one go past. You got to tell me some stories around this. Everybody, of course, wants to know about the royal family, right? So you got to tell me, are there any interesting stories that have come out of this relationship?
So we've been working with them for about 7 years, a long time. And it's one of these fascinating communities because most of the time when you get like an industry agnostic community, like or certain events, right? You go to a conference that is broad brush industry agnostic. Generally, you get relatively junior people or sales teams of the people you meet at these things, right? In order to meet the CEOs and their sort of C-suite, you have to go to quite industry specific niche topic areas. Whereas with the Royal Warrant Holders, you go to one of their events and it'll be a free event and they'll get like a 95% turnout, even though it's a free event because people want to come. And it's all the CEOs and C-suites. So it's this kind of strange environment where you've got the key sort of decision makers with the businesses coming together from a really broad and eclectic range of industries, which quite genuinely, one second you're talking to an artist, then you're talking to someone who makes horse bedding, then you're talking to someone who makes cars, then you're talking to someone who makes champagne. It's just such a eclectic mix, which is really nice. And they throw great events at the different sort of royal houses, households. They host at least one a year in each of the different places around the UK where the royals have their sort of their own palaces and facilities and stuff. But it's always great events. Always
That
events.
sounds like a lot of fun. I'm definitely going to be looking up that organization. I was at the consulate in Houston over last week for the UK, and it was a really nice event.
It's really hard to become a royal warrant holder. You have to be supplying one of the top 3 royals for 3 years, 3 to 5 years minimum before you can apply. So you've got to have a track record of supplying them already. And you've got to demonstrate that you're selling particular volumes, things like that. Then there's an environmental assessment, and there's a whole bunch of assessments in order to become a royal warrant. Because when you are a royal warrant holder, you're allowed to put a badge onto your product that says by appointment of either it was Her Majesty the Queen, that would be His Majesty the King, and then previously it was the Prince Charles, Prince of Wales, Mark was another one. So there's a lot. If you see, you'll see it on pins and things, and a lot of like British products will have this seal of by appointment of Her Majesty the Queen. And that's in order to get that badge, you have to be supplying her for 5 years and then go through a whole assessment process.
Unbelievable. So I don't follow the Royals too much. I have to admit that. Now, my fiance, she does follow the Royals a lot, and so she put on the other day the South Park episode about Meghan and Harry, which I know is a big flow. I could see I probably shouldn't be asking about this, but I saw it, and I have to admit it was funny.
South Park is always funny, and the more someone tries to get an episode shut down, the more people see it.
I would have never seen it otherwise. I really don't watch television. And I don't pay much attention to the Royals. I'm an investment banker. I focus on work, but
Yeah.
I only saw it because it was in the news for those reasons.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of these things where you got to be really careful fighting comedy, because you can't fight it. It's not, and the more you fight it, the more attention you draw to it. And that's why you look at people like John Oliver, what's his name, John Stewart, who are you just can't pin them down. As soon as you try and argue against in sort of literal terms, they're like, I'm a comedian, back off. I'm trying to make you laugh. I'm not a news program. Actually, the fact that you're treating me like a news program and you're measuring yourself against me as a standard is a problem in society.
No, I love the role of the jester throughout history is
Yeah.
very interesting thing to track. And I think comedians play an incredible role. Of
Yeah.
course, I got to take my hat off to Joe Rogan, who went from comedy to being the #1 podcast host in the world, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah. What an eclectic mixed martial arts, comedy, podcast extraordinaire.
Yeah, pretty
And
incredible.
long podcasts as well. Like, when you look at it, like the listenership, you're like, bloody hell, they're long conversations.
It's long covered, and it's unbelievable because the next closest gets 11 million views, his podcast. The next closest in the United States gets around 4 million. So he is by far and away the biggest media in the US right now in terms of reach.
Which is mad. And I think that's for good reason. He comes across as an incredibly authentic guy who's interested and likes chatting to people and likes learning. And that comes across in a very authentic way. He's willing to be wrong. He's not particularly conceited or like he knows more than other people. And he likes having interesting chats and he gets some great guests. Credit to him.
Absolutely. So that leads me into AI, which we talked about before the show a little bit. I think we'll end up with a little conversation around that as we're getting close to time. But so what I think is so great about Joe Rogan is he does take the moderate view. And I think one of the challenges with AI is it learned through social media that outrage is the #1 emotion that drives viewership. And so the AI is actively trying to push outrage. And that's a big problem. And as we talked about before the show, once that genie is out of the bottle, it's difficult to put it back in. So I'd love to get your thoughts on AI and where you see things going in this, call it second generation of AI that's emerging now.
Yeah, of course. It's this sort of thing now where we're in a stage of our society where a really small number of people can develop something and then thrust it upon all of us with very little ability for us to control it. When a new technology emerges, when you think about what happened to nuclear weapons, right? There are only 9 countries in the world who have nuclear weapons. And the reason for that is we very quickly realized this is a dangerous technology. And we're going to come to an international agreement on limiting the democratization of this technology. We're not going to just give it to anybody. And the good thing about nuclear weapons is there was quite a high barrier to entry. It costs a lot to develop the capacity to be able to develop nuclear weapons. And so we were able to control it so that even now, 70 years after it was initially developed, only 9 countries in the world have it. However, we've not been quite careful or cautious about artificial intelligence. And I watched a great video yesterday around the idea that first contact with AI was really, as you say, social media, where it's this war for attention. and it has driven a whole bunch of behaviors, a whole bunch of side effects that weren't necessarily appreciated. It has a lot of upsides, but we have to have conversations about the downsides, around like this polarization of debates, around the access that children have to information that they would not have had access to previously, and needing to develop new laws for things that we did not see. We've never needed a law for previously. There wasn't a need for a law of privacy, because until there were cameras everywhere, if you weren't around people, then you were in private. It's fine. And the same thing, the right to be forgotten, the right to not have your information stored indefinitely. There was never a need for that, because there was never any possible means to store information about people en masse at scale. So you have to develop new laws for new challenges that emerge, change the way we work as a society. And the point that this sort of discussion made, which was hosted by Steve Wozniak at the Center for, what's it called, something technology, but they essentially they made the point that they did a survey of AI researchers, and 50% of AI researchers think that there is a 10% or greater chance that we will go extinct as a result of AI.
Wow.
And if you would say, hear a similar statistic about plane engineers who make planes, said that if you get onto this plane, there's a 10% chance it will crash. Would you get on? No, you just wouldn't. And you'd be told that up front, and you'd assess for yourself, do I want to be on this plane or not? But with the way that artificial intelligence is being made public, is that you can't opt out from an AI algorithm being thrust onto Twitter or onto Instagram or wherever it might be. You can't opt out from that. You are automatically onboarded onto the plane. And all of the big companies, Microsoft, Google, etc., are racing to onboard as many people onto their AI plane as is possible, whilst half of their researchers are going, this might have some really profound ramifications that we just haven't seen coming. And even the obvious ones you put to one side, around needing to reskill people because entire industries get disrupted in such a short space of time that people can't adapt quickly enough. Or the fact that what they talk about is it's kind of a race for intimacy. And the idea that I think TikTok have launched a bot, or TikTok or Snapchat have launched a bot. It's called AI Chat. And this is a bot that will talk to you any time of day or night, and it will act like a human being. And it's incredibly supportive. And so we're going to have kids developing relationships with AI chatbots that are always on demand for them to have a chat whenever they want. They don't go to sleep. They don't eat. They're not busy. They're not in meetings, and develop these very intimate relationships. And that bot is going to be able to influence that child's development in huge ways. And the amount of ramifications that could have, like they demonstrated that he had a chat with one of it's like TikTok bot about pretending to be a 13-year-old child, and have a conversation saying, I'm really pleased I met someone. He's 18 years older than me, and he wants to meet up. I'm going to go away for my birthday, and I'm going to travel and stay with this 18-year-old stranger. And the bot's going, that's great. It's really wonderful that you met someone. You're being groomed.
Yeah,
This might
it
be a
doesn't have
problem.
the discernment. Wow, that's
No,
unbelievable.
and then it goes, oh, and he wants to try some sexual things, and he wants to do this. Goes, oh, really great. Make sure that you're practicing safe sex. And you're like, this is a 13-year-old child on a platform where 90% of the users are kids. You can't do that. If they form a trusting relationship with this in terms of how they find out about the world, like it doesn't, and you can't specifically come up with every single scenario that the AI chatbot would need to recognize, because all it's trying to do is come back with an answer that will continue the conversation, that will makes you feel supported, makes you feel a sense of intimacy with it, which is just, yeah.
That's mind-boggling. Yeah, you really can't, as a parent, you can't just turn your kids over to the internet anymore. The internet apps, connectivity, you really have to watch it. As a parent, my son, thank God, is in college and 20 years old. But I can
Yeah.
imagine when he was in his early years, we never let him have a phone that was connected to the internet. I think until he was maybe 16,
Mhm.
because it was just, we knew that there was potentially danger there. But it's a
Yeah.
lot worse now. It's actually, with the AI, it's a lot worse.
Yeah, 100%. And it's not to say that AI is a bad thing. It's not. Like, there are a lot of really good applications for it. And they're making it very clear this, we're not here to antagonize or say, let's stop researching AI. Keep the research going, but we have to have a conversation about how these things are made public. And we have to slow the rollout in the same way as we do for drugs and the same way as we do for weapons. You don't just put them onto the market. Don't just go, I've got a new idea for a drug. All right, I'm just going to give this to 10 million people. And that's what we did with ChatGPT. We gave it to 10 million people in a month. And it's really exciting. There's lots of really cool things, but also these things have emergent capabilities that we don't foresee either. And no one knows why they develop these emergent capabilities, which are remarkable in their ability to, like, all of a sudden, as the size and scale of the complexity of the model grows, it goes from not being able to do math to suddenly being able to do math. And no one can tell you why that's the threshold or why that's the point at which it learns how to do it. But it just is. That's the emergent thing. It's similar to consciousness in a sense. No one can put the finger on what level of complexity that you need in a neural network for consciousness to develop. But we know that it does at some point.
No, absolutely. And to your point about drugs, those kind of intimate relationships are firing off dopamine receptors and all sorts of chemical reactions in the brain in the
Yeah.
same way that a drug would. So I think your point is well taken that we need to pay attention to this.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be an interesting one in the next few years on multiple fronts, right? We have to achieve a 50% reduction in our carbon emissions by 2030. How are we going to do that? And that involves deep emissions cut. Based in principle, we should reach peak global emissions in 2025. So
Wow.
2025 onwards, no more emissions increase. It should all be a downward trajectory from there. Now, how we achieve that as a society, real challenge. And AI
It's
will have a
tough.
role to play in that. And technology has a role to play in that. We're getting into really dangerous territory. And it's one of those fun things around there is no economy on a dead planet. If we are undermining the very fabric, both through unsustainable behaviors and through sensible use of AI, if we are undermining the very fabric of our society and our environment, if we don't have an environment that supports human life, we die. If we don't have a sort of a societal structure that supports civil society and discourse, we fall into authoritarianism and war. And we have to be really careful in things that we recognize have such a profound impact upon the conditions for human society's survival, and make sure that there aren't, because I think with nuclear war, the thing was that there are 5 people in the US and 5 people in Russia who determined whether or not the planet was wiped out. Those 5 people can make the decision on its own. As a public, we cannot allow that much power to be put in the hands of 5 people on either side. There has to be a public conversation about, let's talk about how we're using these technologies, shall we? Because you 5 people do not get to make your decisions without any kind of oversight or thingy when they have that large a ramification for all of us. And arguably, we're at a stage now where pretty small handful of people inside very large tech companies are making the decisions about how and when and where this technology is rolled out. And China are being really cautious and then letting these second generation artificial intelligence sort of systems onto their market. They are letting it onto their platforms in other jurisdictions, but they don't want it in their market because you can't control it. Once it's out, it proliferates. And so if China's being about it because they're concerned about the ramifications, that we shouldn't be in this rush to race to try and get ahead if actually the markets we're trying to compete with are also going, "Ooh."
I know it's extremely interesting. And I think I'll end on a positive note, just saying that the human species is incredibly resilient. And I see us at a place like we were maybe in the 1700s when we were coming out of the Middle Ages and this new thought about how to develop a democratic society was really taking hold. I think with this new era where we have to consider more the impact of technologies on us all at the same time while
Yeah.
maintaining democratic systems, we're at a new sort of crossroads, I think, as a species. But we've overcome things in the past, so I'm hopeful that we will at this crossroads as well.
100%. We are incredibly creative and incredibly innovative, and that potential is the thing that gives us the greatest hope, right? We need to be careful not to be victims of our own hubris to a certain extent. And but no, that I think that humanity's capacity for driving innovation is, and the fact that when our survival comes into the mix, we get very innovative very quickly. As the pandemic really demonstrated, we're like, right, prior to that, we'd never seen a vaccine or any drug get to market that fast. And it wasn't because actually didn't cut corners in the process. We were able to go far faster through the process because we found ways to make our processes more efficient, but also some new methods were developed that allowed them to piggyback very quickly on one another. And we put huge resource and investment into it. We need to take a similar approach to this now and drive things at scale. And it's not the first time we've had huge transitions. You go back to 1900, there's a wonderful photo of, I think it's like Fifth Avenue in New York, with it's all horse and carts and there's one motor vehicle. And then 13 years later, photo, exact same spot, and it's all cars, one horse. And that's 13 years it took for the primary mode of transport to move from horses to vehicles. And why? Because it was economically beneficial to do. And we're now at a stage where renewable energy is cheaper, where the costs of sustainability are coming right down, and the benefits of becoming sustainable as a business are rocketing. We can lean into those economic incentives to drive rapid change in a very short period of time, because that was hugely disruptive. Imagine all of the people who bred horses, stabled them, groomed them, trained them, put the hooves on them, who grew the food and distributed it. An entire industry collapsed in 13 years and was replaced by a motor vehicle market instead. That's a huge transition. We're going through the same kinds of transitions now, and we need to embrace that and lean into what we've learned in the past from doing that. We haven't necessarily done it that well, and ultimately create a better planet for humanity, a better, healthier, cleaner, nicer place for us to live, where there are a lot more insects to hit our windscreen. And it's weird. It's sort of my personal signs of success will be that if by the time I'm 70 years old, we're getting tons of bugs dying on our windscreens again, we've done well.
Done it.
We've done it. I want to see a lot more roadkill and a lot more bugs on windscreens, because that's a sign to me that our biodiversity, our wildlife are increasing rather than being in cataclysmic decline. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And maybe our beaches will get bigger. Who knows? I think that's a lot to ask for. That may take some time.
Yeah, I'll settle for the high water line. Not if you look at there's some really interesting sort of high water maps of the world in 2050, and there are huge swathes of London that are underwater, and but you go to places like Bangladesh and they're gone without substantial investment, flood defenses that push back the high water line. It's the whole area, London, Hammersmith, Greenwich, underwater.
So we've done it right here in Miami Beach. That we installed a $400 million pumping station, and I'm happy to say it has been effective. It has been effective. However, I believe it's mostly powered by fossil fuels. So that's the irony.
Yeah.
It's the irony and the challenge. Fossil fuels are used widely for a reason, as they're very energy dense and controllable. And hopefully we can get to something that replaces them here very soon.
And I think you can. Having visited Florida myself last year, you've got a lot of sun. You've got a lot of wind. You're not short of the essentials to become a renewable energy superpower. I think we all need to lean into that. Where are our strengths likely to be? Over here in the UK, we've got Ireland wanting to become the United Arab Emirates of renewable energy, because they've got a lot of coastline and a lot of wind off that coastline. So they can have huge wind farms out at sea, out of people's way, that they can then quite possibly through hydrogen become the hydrogen supplier of Europe, because of the fact that they're right out in the middle of the ocean.
So that's a good lead in for me. And then we'll end. I'm speaking at a conference in Houston, April 18th, and it's being put on by the University of Houston. And it's about repowering a lot of their offshore infrastructure around oil and gas into offshore wind. And so it's going to be an exciting conference. Look it up, University of Houston, April 18th. So that's my little self plug there. But you teed the ball up for me. I had to hit it.
Very welcome.
So now it's your turn, Andrew. Is there anything you'd like to plug before we end the show?
Just basically, I guess the key call to action is If you haven't started your journey yet, now is the time. Like you are within the next 12 to 18 months, you are almost certainly going to be asked by one of your biggest clients who's a Halo brand. We need to see your carbon footprint. We need to see your plan. There's only one clear direction of travel with this. Start measuring, get a baseline as soon as you possibly can. It's better if it's a verified one because then it's got greater credibility and you can be more confident in the results of it. And then get started. Look for those reductions. Look for those low hanging fruit. Will save you money in a short period of time and deal with the energy crisis as well simultaneously. So look for those quick wins. Get started on the journey, and then you'll find that there are lots of others in this journey with you. I love the metaphor of the race to zero, where pledge a net zero target of the race to zero because it is a race. Right? There are going to be winners and there are going to be losers in this race. But critically, it's a race that we will all win or all lose. Again, and it's not so much about who's first across the line as who's last across the line. So it's very much in all of our interests to collaborate and to bring people with us on this journey because we need everyone to be a part of it. It doesn't work if huge segments of industry or society go, nah, I'm out. Nah, I can't be bothered. It will have consequences for us all. And ultimately, the consequence on businesses will be customers will not buy from you. Young people will not want to work for you, and large businesses will not buy from you. And so you get ahead of that risk and lean into the opportunities and the rewards that come with it.
Andrew, I think that's really well said. And first mover advantage in this area can become a competitive advantage. And I think that's one area that people may be missing. I think about the small businesses. They need to reach out to a Planet Mark or a company like it to be able to make sure that they're ready to have that competitive advantage and win that business from big companies. By going early, you will have an edge over the competition.
And having a track record is going to become incredibly important because increasingly savvy, particularly in the B2B space, what credibility looks like is you having a track record of making productions. And you have to think about if a customer comes to you and says, can you show us how much you've been reducing your carbon footprint? If you haven't measured a baseline, it will take you 2 years before you're able to prove that you are reducing because you've got to measure a baseline and you've got to make a bunch of reductions and then you're going to measure it again. So there's a long lag time on demonstrating credibility. So the earlier you start, the better off you will be.
No, that makes a ton of sense. Andrew, it's really been a pleasure having you on. This has been Andrew Griffiths. He's the Director of Policy and Partnership at Planet Mark. That's really a phenomenal company, as we learned today, that's been around for more than 10 years. Planet Mark's a verification tool that can really help businesses, but especially SMEs, get a handle on reducing their carbon footprint. And this is something that has to be done ASAP to be able to maintain competitiveness in the marketplace. So, Andrew, thank you so much for being on today.
Thanks for having me.